Shot clock down to 3. Bass up top to Rondo. Puts up another 3. Bang! Rajon Rondo again. The Boston Celtics win Game 7 here at the TD Garden.
There's only one reasonable conclusion to draw. The process was a disaster.
The process is dead, and the NBA should be celebrating this.
Take that trust the process lingo and go to hell with it.
When looking at the Eastern Conference over the late 2010s and early 2020s, there's been a handful of teams that have consistently been contenders each year. All of them have eventually broken through into the NBA Finals. The Miami Heat, Boston Celtics, and Milwaukee Bucks haven't been perfect every year, but they've still had their one shining moment where it all came together. For that, there's a level of respect that these groups have from their peers. They've shown that at least on one occasion, they can defeat their doubters. But there's one team I failed to mention that's also on this list. A franchise that at one point had a brighter future than all of these squads. A team that was put in the best possible position to succeed, only to play their cards so poorly that they never got their shining moment. I'm talking about the most mismanaged contender in the NBA, the Philadelphia 76ers. For all the biting ridicule they receive on social media, I don't think people realize just how badly they mess things up. In 2017, they had a boatload of cap space, dozens of first-round picks to work with, and a talented young core that was revered across the league. In the matter of only a few years, they squandered it all, with 0 Eastern Conference Finals appearances to their name at the end of it. They destroyed their team and reputation, and lost the trust of their fans. The Sixers initially committed to building a contender in 2013, so what mistakes did they make that ultimately killed their championship hopes? As it turns out, it's way more than you think. The Sixers had 4 separate executives who oversaw the current Joel Embiid process era that has stretched for the last decade. First up was Sam Hinkie, who has the most admiration from Philly fans. Hinkie did some great things. For one, he drafted Joel Embiid, the MVP himself, after a draft day injury caused him to slide down the board. He also traded Michael Carter-Williams for what would end up being the 10th pick in the 2018 draft. Not to mention, he fleeced the Kings in a deal that would help the Sixers jump from the number 5 pick to number 3 during the 2017 draft. With all of these excellent moves, there did come the occasional blunder. One of the first moves Hinkie made as an executive was to trade guard Drew Holiday for the 6th pick Nerlens Noel during the 2013 draft, a big man who would turn out to be a bust. In that same draft, he also selected the aforementioned Michael Carter-Williams over Giannis Antetokounmpo. 2 years later in 2015, he selected another bust with the 3rd pick, Jahlil Okafor, over Kristaps Porzingis and Devin Booker. Why didn't they pick one of these two? In reality, Booker wasn't drafted until later on at the 13th pick, while Porzingis was rumored to have a distaste for Philly, refusing to work out with them, so this mistake is more understandable. All in all, if these were the biggest errors Philly made during the process era, they'd be swimming in a lake of championships right now. The truth is, Sam Hinkie wasn't perfect, but he was sure as hell better than anyone else who had come after him. In December 2015, Adam Silver and the NBA forced the Sixers to hire Jerry Colangelo as the chairman of basketball operations, which all but unofficially ended the Sam Hinkie era. The Sixers had been infiltrated from the outside, and Hinkie stepped down 4 months later, as all the power he once had to make decisions was given to Jerry. For as much hate as members in the Sixers front office get for the team's failure, I rarely see that criticism directed towards Josh Harris, the Sixers owner. There's multiple poor choices that he made, or chose not to make, that hurt the franchise. One of them was letting Adam Silver and Jerry Colangelo bully their way into the organization, and subsequently kicking Hinkie out. Jerry Colangelo hired his son Brian, who then became the 2nd executive during the process era. Nepotism at its finest. If you think Hinkie made a few poor choices, then Brian made a boatload of them. Colangelo's first move was to handle the number 1 overall pick, in which he chose Ben Simmons from LSU. Mr. Free Throw himself, huh? It's easy to become a victim of revisionist history here and claim the Sixers should have chosen Brandon Ingram or Jaylen Brown first instead. But in actuality, Ben Simmons was worth a top pick. His tenure ended poorly, of course, but he was a multiple-time All-Star and Defensive Player of the Year candidate with Philly. At the time during the 2016 draft, picking Ingram or Brown number 1 would have been a fireable offense. Simmons was the consensus top guy. The real mistakes came during the later part of the first round. With the 24th and 26th picks, they chose Timothé Luwawu-Cabarrot and Furkan Korkmaz over Pascal Siakam and DeJounte Murray. Instead of picking Embiid's friend and fellow Cameroonian in Siakam, Colangelo invested in quote-unquote shooters who would turn out to be duds. It ain't easy to pick a useful player deep into the draft in the NBA. It's almost like closing your eyes and throwing a dart at a wall. But as you'll soon find out, the Sixers whiffed so many times over the years that it's genuinely comical. This draft is looked at favorably compared to the atrocities the Sixers would commit in future years. Nowadays, the Sixers have been plagued by such massive cap issues that it's completely destroyed any chances of them picking up big-name free agents. Where did these issues start? The summer of 2016. Jared Bayless, a so-called sharpshooter, was handed a 3-year, $27 million deal in July 2016. He played just 42 games for the team in 3 seasons. Philly fans would end up despising Bayless, as he was paid far too much for his lack of production. It's fascinating looking back to a point where the Sixers' worst paid player on the roster was a guy who was being given just $9 million a year. Simpler times for sure. To add flames to the fire, Christian Wood would also be let go by Philly during this summer too. The then G-Leaguer would go on to become a useful player that surely would have helped the Sixers in their title chase. Speaking of valuable big men, Jeremy Grant, the now well-known offensive power forward, was traded by Philly to OKC just 1 game into the 2016-17 season. Ersan Ilyasova and a pick was received in this deal. The Sixers got fleeced. Grant, like Wood, would also become a great starting level player. But the first cracks in the domain of the Sixers' title hopes didn't start forming until a few months later. At this point in early 2017, the Sixers were admired for having an incredible situation. They had a boatload of picks, young players, and cap space to work with for the future. But the promising hopes surrounding this team would soon take a turn for the worse. The summer of 2017, particularly the 2017 draft for the Sixers, would go down as one of the most wasted opportunities in NBA history. They first started off by making a bold move. Philly traded up from the 3rd pick to the number 1 spot, bringing up their fanbase's excitement tenfold. This would be the championship-winning move. It was a chance to establish a dominant big 3 of young players: Markelle Fultz, Ben Simmons, and Joel Embiid, all who were projected to be future superstars. Now here comes the part where revisionist history overwhelms the mind of the average NBA fan. Was taking Markelle Fultz with the number 1 pick a bad decision at the time? Was trading up for him the wrong choice too? All Philly ended up trading to move to the top pick was Romeo Langford, who was the 14th pick in the 2019 draft. It's a trade that 10 out of 10 teams would make. Philly literally moved up 2 spots for free. The problem arises with their selection, that being Markelle Fultz. He was a player who was touted as a unanimous top pick, a flawless prospect who would fit in perfectly with Embiid and Simmons. Unfortunately, Fultz soon developed a shoulder condition called thoracic outlet syndrome after being drafted. This ruined his time in Philly, as Fultz's strongest trait in college, his 3-point shooting, was taken away from him in an instant. Not to mention, the Celtics ended up with Jason Tatum at the 3rd pick. Damn. The Sixers' selection of Fultz marked the first time that they were somewhat vulnerable in the process era. They had made their first enormous mistake. Fultz not panning out meant the Sixers had to scramble for a 3rd star to fill his shoes. The picks that followed Fultz in this class were equally as cringe-inducing. The Sixers left the draft with Andres Pasicnic, Jonah Bolden, and Matthias Lazort. Never heard of them, huh? That tells you all you need to know. They lost out on guys like Kyle Kuzma, Josh Hart, and Monte Morris. At the end of the 2017 draft, the Sixers, who had 5 draft picks, left with 0 long-term pieces. It was a historic level of incompetence from their front office. Ever wonder why Philly will never win a ring with Joel Embiid? This draft is why. 12 months later, Brian Colangelo was fired following the Sixers' disappointing 2nd-round exit to the Boston Celtics. It must have been because Philly woke up and realized he wasn't a good executive, right? Wrong. They fired him because he was exposed for having secret burner accounts on Twitter used to criticize the players on his own team. Yeah, you heard that right. A laughable event that's all too fitting for this organization. Josh Harris, the owner, had a big decision to make. Who do they promote as the executive to replace Colangelo? After all, the crucial 2018 draft was coming up. They chose Brett Brown as the temporary substitution, the head coach at the time with no front office experience. Unsurprisingly, a guy with no history of making trades ended up making one of the worst trades in Sixers draft day history. After selecting hometown kid Mikal Bridges with the 10th pick, they traded him to Phoenix for Zaire Smith in a 2021 Heat first-round pick. Zaire Smith almost died due to a peanut allergy that he sustained before playing a single game as a pro, while the first-round pick ended up being a nothing burger. Mikal Bridges, as we all know, is an incredible 3-and-D wing and fringe all-star. The Sixers had him in their grasp and let him go. The guy was from Philly, for crying out loud. It would have been the perfect story, but this team just had to screw it up. If Mikal Bridges was added to the Sixers, who knows how differently the last half of the decade could have gone for them. Maybe he would have been the push to lead Philly past Kawhi in 2019. Or perhaps he could have helped them beat the Celtics in 2023. But I guess we'll never know. The third executive for Philly was Elton Brand, who, unlike Hinkie and Colangelo, wasn't afraid of going all in. He had no problem gutting the team's assets and cap space, as long as it ended in a championship. They couldn't even make it past the second round. Like Brett Brown, he also had no experience in being a general manager. Why, in an incredibly important stage for the franchise, did Josh Harris and his team insist on bringing in executives with no experience? It's nonsensical decision making. The big two moves from Brand were trading for Jimmy Butler and Tobias Harris during the 2018-19 season. They traded for Butler because it became clear Markelle Fultz could not be the third star the team needed. They traded for Harris because the Jeremy Grant trade 2 years prior left them with no good power forwards. The problem here wasn't necessarily the trades themselves, but how they handled it afterwards. Following the famous Kawhi Leonard Game 7 buzzer beater in the 2019 playoffs, the Sixers entered a crucial offseason that would decide the future of their franchise. What followed was one of the worst offseasons ever. They chose to give a max contract to Tobias, but not Jimmy, a move that would perhaps go down as the biggest error they ever made. Letting go of Jimmy Butler, a certified superstar and culture-changing player, was such a massive fumble that it can very well be the sole cause for why the team never won a ring during this era. To add insult to injury, Butler was disrespected on his way out. He reported that members of the Sixers front office asked each other if they could control him, which was all Jimmy needed to hear. The unmerited smugness of Philly's front office was on full display here, and it would cost them immensely. Butler chose Miami, and the Heat sent back Josh Richardson, an off-the-bench man, in exchange for him in a sign-and-trade. Josh Richardson for Jimmy Butler. The jokes write themselves. The Sixers followed this mistake by giving Tobias Harris $180 million over the next 5 years. This crippled their cap space indefinitely. This contract would be the reason why Philly consistently had little to no flexibility in terms of trying to get bench pieces. A high percentage of the money was going to Tobias Harris, a player who always shriveled under the pressure come playoff time. They then gave the money that would have gone to Butler to Al Horford, which would become a bottom 5 contract just a few months after the pen hit the paper. Giving a 33-year-old big man who played the same position as your best player $109 million is bad. The 2019 offseason for Philly was horrible, and led to a miserable 2019-20 season that ended in a round 1 sweep to Boston. Elton Brand and his team speedrun the How to Destroy a Team in 1 Year challenge. Unsurprisingly, Brand lasted just 2 years as the main executive on the team until Daryl Morey came to town and took his job. But that didn't stop Brand from hiring Doc Rivers as head coach before he was demoted. His final mistake that would once again screw the team. Now we enter a new time of Sixers basketball, a time removed from all the old faces of the past. The Sixers have a new coach, and a flashy new executive named Daryl Morey from the Houston Rockets ready to steer the ship. Immediately, an opportunity was given to them, only for the ball to be dropped once more. A name that you'll become quite accustomed to hearing became available for the first time, that name being James Harden. What people forget was that in 2020, James Harden said that he wanted to go to Philly after requesting a trade from the Houston Rockets. This wasn't washed Harden, this was MVP level beast Harden. Pairing him with rising superstar Joel Embiid surely would have competed for a championship, if not won one. Not to mention, getting rid of Ben Simmons before he would self-implode would have been a huge win too. Some reports say the Rockets denied everything the Sixers offered because they had personal beef with Morey, while others say the Sixers refused to part ways with young guard Tyrese Maxey, and that's why it didn't work out. If the latter is the reality, then they should have gotten rid of Maxey. James Harden was an MVP candidate with Brooklyn before his hamstring injury. He would have been incredible with Joel Embiid. Maxey is talented, but he was also a rookie at the time and wasn't contributing anything towards winning yet. Either way, the trade fell through, and Harden was sent to Brooklyn instead. Things went poorly for Philly soon after. In the 2021 playoffs, they lost in embarrassing fashion to the underdog Atlanta Hawks in round 2. Ben Simmons played horribly. After receiving criticism from his coach and his teammate in their post-game interviews, he refused to play another game for the squad, demanding a trade. The situation sucked, but Daryl Morey soon had a light bulb. While Simmons was holding out, another opportunity at getting his favorite player James Harden had arrived. This time, he succeeded, but it was a mistake. On February 10th, 2022, the Sixers gave up Ben Simmons, Seth Curry, Andre Drummond, and 2 first-round picks for the Beard, which wasn't necessarily a bad move itself. The bad move was not having a concrete plan in mind regarding Harden's contract situation. James wanted to get paid, and Daryl became firmly against it. This would eventually lead to an emotional explosion. The other poor decision with this trade was skipping out on Tyrese Halliburton, who was reportedly on the table for the Sixers to get for even cheaper than what Harden cost. Halliburton is not only the better player than Harden now, but he's also 10 years younger, and would have extended Philly's contention window exponentially. But Morey's infatuation with the bearded one made him lose all common sense. He became convinced that he needed his former Houston Rockets players of the past on his team. PJ Tucker, Danuel House Jr., and Montrezl Harrell were all brought to the Sixers within the span of a few months. Daryl Morey tampered for Tucker and House, costing the Sixers valuable second-round picks that they needed. Money that went to these guys should have gone to a much better role player like Bruce Brown, who instead went on to win the championship with Denver. But how did they get this money to begin with? In June 2022, James Harden, after tense negotiations, took a pay cut to help the Sixers sign better players. Under the table, the two agreed that in the following summer, Harden would receive the Brinks truck. That didn't happen. Why? The reasoning is because the play on the court from James Harden was underwhelming when his team needed him the most. All that resulted from this blockbuster trade were 2 puny second-round exits. And now I'd like to shift my criticisms from the front office to the players. In these 2 second-round exits in 2022 and 2023, the players on this team, specifically the top 2 stars, Joel Embiid and James Harden, were a disgrace. The moments that highlighted this the most came in Games 6 and 7 of the 2023 second-round series against Boston. Philly took a 3-2 lead, only needing to win 1 more game out of the next 2 to finally make the Eastern Conference Finals for the first time since 2001. But in the ensuing 2 games, Harden and Embiid refused to step up. In Game 6, the Celtics were all but begging to be sent home, but the Sixers just couldn't do it. Everyone on Philly played terribly, and they choked a late-game lead to lose. Harden shot 0 of 6 in the 4th quarter, while Embiid was invisible. In Game 7, the Celtics finally woke up and destroyed the Sixers. Embiid and Harden combined for 8 of 29 shooting in a 24-point loss. The 2 stars mentally checked out. Look around the league at other superstars. Jokic, Giannis, LeBron, Curry, Luka, KD. They may not be perfect every time in the playoffs, but they have never gone as far as to check out and give up on their team in the most important game of the season. The role players on the Sixers follow the lead of the best players, and if the star duo is sulking around with loser energy, then so too will everyone behind them. The 2023 playoffs for the Sixers were a golden opportunity for them to end the negative narrative surrounding their postseason history, but all they ended up doing was confirming what everyone already believed. They just weren't good enough. There's only 2 common denominators for why the Sixers have been such a pathetic franchise over the last 10 years. It's Joel Embiid and Josh Harris who have been there every step of the way. Harris seems more concerned with managing NFL teams than giving a second thought to the Sixers. He let the NBA and other owners walk over him with the Sam Hinkie firing, and he has let a losing culture infest the team from top to bottom. He is the worst owner out of the major 3 Philadelphia sports teams, and it's because he doesn't have a passion for managing the franchise. While other owners around the league run their organizations with the motive of winning, the motive for Harris is money. Joel Embiid embodies everything wrong with the losing culture. For as talented as he is, his physical toughness doesn't translate to mental toughness on the court. The moping and poor body language he displays the second things aren't going perfect for him is pathetic. Why on earth does he need to be given a motivational speech by his teammate with 1 minute left in the fourth quarter of a playoff game? Shouldn't he be driven and aggressive by default? He had the largest points per game drop by an MVP in NBA history, going from a strong 33 in the regular season to a measly 23 in the playoffs. A similar case happened with him in 2022, where he dropped from 30 to 23. He has the sketchiest postseason history out of any superstar in the league. No conference finals appearances, few iconic moments, just loss after loss after loss. His biggest defenders point to this playoff regression and say it was all caused by injuries, which is a fair statement on the surface. But the reality is, Joel Embiid is never healthy when his team needs him the most. Every single playoff run except the bubble in 2020, Embiid has been hit with an injury that has derailed his play. Sometimes it's a facial injury, other times it's a knee or stomach sickness that hurts him. So yes, maybe it's not his fault that he's often injured and tends to play worse in the postseason, but it's damn near impossible to win it all when your best player goes down every playoff run. The Sixers have made so many poor choices over the years that nothing can save them. They've spent every asset, used all their money, and burnt every bridge. Speaking of burning bridges, James Harden and Daryl Morey now despise each other. Harden's pay cut in the summer of 2022 was met with the expectation that he'd get huge amounts of money the following year. Once July 2023 arrived and Philly said no thank you, Harden threw a fit, vowing to never be a part of an organization Morey was a part of. These two had an incredible relationship for years in Houston. Morey said Harden changed his life. Now it's all come crashing down. The big Harden trade turned out to be one more failure. Just another story to add to the inevitable 30 for 30 on this franchise. There's fewer teams that have made as many mistakes as the Philadelphia 76ers have in such a short period of time. Whether it's handing out terrible contracts that crippled their flexibility, or time and time again swinging and missing when given a top pick in a draft class, or them letting go of valuable pieces that were in the palm of their hands, the blunders are endless. In 2012, the Sixers lost to the Celtics in 7 in round 2. It was the last playoff series before the process started. 11 years later, the Sixers once again lost to Boston in 7, in none other than round 2. They started the process to end their early playoff exits once and for all, but they ended up in the same spot they were before it all began. The Sixers have dug themselves into a hole that's too deep. The only way to get out is by starting over again.